Hey, welcome everybody to our session today. We are excited to have a couple of guests on who really are skilled, knowledgeable, and very erudite in the arena of scaling consulting firms. So the title of the session is Don't Let Your Back Office Hold You Back. As always, our safe harbor statement and any unrelated services or features referenced in this or other presentations are not currently available, may not be delivered on time or at all. Our agenda today is packed with some real practical ways to size and dimensionalize and think about scaling your business. We'll kick off with what do operations mean? Why are they important in the infrastructure of growth? Introduce you to the Kennedy Professional Services Profitability Benchmark, talk through overhead discipline, and the idea of the risk of ignoring the back office as you scale. The Kennedy folks have been really quoted extensively, particularly in the past couple of years, as AI and other business pressures really force themselves into the consulting industry. So you might have seen quotes from Tom Rodenhauser, who I'll introduce next, and Ramon on just this real dynamic, exciting, but also fraught with peril, all the change in the consulting industry, really driven right now by a lot of the AI pressure. So Ramon is part of the Kennedy Consulting M&A practice and works a lot with firms like many of yours in helping them scale, structure, potentially take on a new acquisition, new capital structure, or exit. Tom leads the Kennedy Intelligence wing of the business, and you can find out more about them and everything Kennedy offers at kennedyintel.com. They're also frequent podcast hosts of us here at Kantata. So let's dive in, guys. First off, Ramon, when you size up and analyze and begin to really explore the journey of growth with a consulting firm, you typically bucket them into kind of 4 different stages of growth. So maybe talk through this, because I think it's really important and probably interesting to a lot of our clients and guests on today.
Yeah, absolutely, Brent. Well, at Kennedy Consult, we typically map the growth of a professional services firm into 4 buckets or stages of growth. It starts off with a stage that most of the listeners will be aware of, which is the founder-led stage. A founder sets up a professional services firm. They're typically leading and managing that firm. It usually has limited back office investments, operational functions. Then as a team starts to develop around the founder, they start to ramp up investments in the back office infrastructure to support the team in delivering services and growing the firm. The latter 2 stages are potentially the more exciting areas from an M&A and investment perspective, and also for organic growth for many of these firms as they start to institutionalize. Existing investments in infrastructure are paying off. They're now developing more sophisticated layers of infrastructure to support the management team, delivery, services, sales, marketing. And then finally, the enterprise level stage is where at Kennedy Consult, we spend a lot of time reviewing performance of firms. And we usually find that 1% or less of professional services firms reach the enterprise stage and deliver growth and value creation sustainably at that level. And it's at that stage where the investments in infrastructure previously have really paid off, and a more sophisticated professional layer of infrastructure and back office investment is required to ensure sustainable value creation going forward. Tom, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, just to add some perspective on the size of the market, 1% of firms get to that enterprise level. We cover all the big firms, but the largest 20 firms constitute almost 65% of the total market, and yet there are thousands of firms out there. I think the point here is there are a lot of firms that face obstacles as they grow through those stages. But to get to that enterprise stage means that you literally are one of the potentially top 200 firms from a size standpoint. So the challenges are there, but I think in terms of scaling the business, it's all about the operations and getting that set up at the outset and not waiting too long.
So let's dive into this idea of the infrastructure of growth. And right after this, we've got a couple of polls before we dive into those different stages. But Ramon, we've talked about this as being setting up the conditions for success, and you help firms a lot of times in their exit, and thinking about that prior to going into scaling and growing is really an imperative. So walk us through this lens that you've come up with as you go through those evaluations with firms.
Yeah, this is really about early on investing in infrastructure in the back office. And we often find that businesses don't really invest early on in infrastructure that's going to help them grow sustainably. And the typical thing that we find is that founders are focused on delivering services, selling services in stages 1 and 2 of growth. They're neglecting investments in operations. And what we find is that that hurts the firm, growing sustainably, driving profitability at the levels that we typically see of high performance consulting firms. Even if they are growing without investing and professionalizing early on, that growth is typically unpredictable, it's lumpy, and the profitability is below those thresholds for high performance consulting firms. So, those that get it right, they achieve more predictable returns. It also improves exit outcomes later down the line. And the big change that we've seen in the last year is that there's a lot more AI-enabled options for firms earlier in their growth journey to professionalize from the get-go.
Tom, we've talked previously on this idea of better infrastructure early, and then heavy concentration of clients, 50-60% of revenue with a founder-led client. And our next couple of slides are going to ask for some participation in polling. But before we do that, do you have anything to add around that idea as you really study, the market makers? Anything that a smaller firm is in their ascendancy you think could draw from?
Yeah, one of the things we look at is that the founder-led firm tends to have a heavy concentration of that business development around the founders and the principals. And what they tend to do as well is they take on the infrastructure tasks. So they try to run the firm, they try to sell the work, and in many cases, they're delivering the work. So when you look at kind of the metrics and you say, where are you allocating your time? What we're finding is founders that allocate a lot of their time to infrastructure as well as the business development are stretched too thin. Ultimately, the quality of the deliverables suffer as well. And so when we look at that, we say, okay, have you really spread that business development? Have you really spread the infrastructure management across the organization and professionalized that way? I think a lot of founders fall into a trap where they think they can do it all. And I've dealt with consultants pretty much my whole business life, and they're very smart folks. But at the same time, the good ones really know when to give up some of these roles. And what you'll find in these next couple of polls is it translates to things like profitability, revenue, and ultimately the value of the firm.
Well, let's fire them up. So our first poll is, what proportion of revenue is typically allocated to overheads for a high performance consulting firm? Give everyone a few seconds. get a couple more answers and then we'll take a look. And then the second poll, the second poll is, what is the EBITDA margin that professional services firms, which investors consider high performance target? Give folks a few seconds to respond. And I'll share the results of this one. I apologize, I blazed through the previous. Looks like 20% was the majority. So as we think through that, let's Ramon, you're gonna kick off the following section here around the professional services profitability benchmarking and what that means to a firm that's scaling.
Yeah, it looks like the responses were pretty spot on. So this is our overview at Kennedy Consult of where we see revenue typically being allocated to costs for a high performance consulting firm at enterprise stage. So that latter stage of growth. Typically less than 50% of revenue is in cost of goods sold. So that results in an over 50% gross margin for that high performance professional services firm. 20 to 30%. So you really have two options there to choose from, but usually somewhere between there is allocated to overheads, and that's split pretty equally between management overheads, operations, sales, marketing, resulting in a 20% plus EBITDA margin. So the important thing to highlight here is that 20% plus EBITDA margin, which is what the polls correctly indicated, is where we see professional services firms that are high performance producing from a profitability perspective. But in today's AI era, those thresholds are changing very quickly. So the cost of goods sold, there's potential now to deliver the same services with less COGS. You can now deliver services at a higher gross margin with the latest AI-enabled tools. And from an overhead perspective, the latest AI-enabled PSA tools allow you to shrink the overheads that are ultimately being used to drive growth in your business, and then ultimately result in a profitability margin which is much higher than 20%. So we're working with firms currently that are talking to us about how 2025 was a good year for them. They were performing well, but their headcount has stayed relatively flat. They're using the latest tools within their organizations to drive profitability. That trend we're expecting to evolve much further in 2026 and result in professional services firms driving even higher profitability.
Yeah, we're actually at a pivotal moment for the industry because AI, for all everyone's writing and talking about AI, the actual effect AI is having on consulting is pretty profound. Some people are writing about it replacing consulting. We think that's kind of silly and at the extreme. But as a tool, it's definitely had the most significant impact on the process of consulting in the last 30 years that I've been dealing with this. The reason is it's changing the construct of the business. So, the traditional pyramid, even small firms essentially are pyramids with the resource bases and kind of building up to the founder partners and the leverage model and the utilization off that, and ultimately time-based billing, right? So what AI is doing is actually minimizing and in some cases eliminating the time component in a way that initially makes the delivery of consulting, process and delivery of consulting, incredibly efficient because we're in a knowledge business. But at the same time, it's not necessarily creating this excessive demand for AI implementation services. So what happens there is you have potentially increase margins, which is great, but you also have to concentrate on the areas of your expertise to provide the value to your clients. Because ultimately, we think the shift is going to be more towards value-based billing and not time-based billing. And I think this changes the construct. And to Ramon's point about EBITDA and the value of a consulting firm, you really want to be as efficient as possible and also kind of own the niche that you're in.
So as we go through, we'll talk a little bit about how, and you've got a framework corresponding with each of the different stages of growth. But before we do that, give us this idea, and Ramon, you've stressed this idea of overhead discipline and starting this early and often. And I notice I've got a quote immortalized here, the silent engine of growth. And we think about operations as really building the conditions for success in consulting. So these four keys you've extrapolated from lots of analysis of different firms that you've consulted with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that quote ultimately rings true from all of our work. From analyses of lots of different professional services firms, both in the US, UK, and globally, there's really four ingredients that we typically see as being important for maintaining overhead discipline. So it's pricing integrity, cash flow discipline, quality controls, and governance structures. And pricing integrity, we really see that about establishing a clear, disciplined pricing policy very early on in the growth journey. There's a move also towards value-based billing models that we're seeing increasingly being important as part of that. Cash flow discipline, and that's critical up front, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But managing receivables, buffering against downturns that might occur later on, and having cash flow discipline and working capital management in place. Quality controls, clearly important about standardizing the outcomes to clients and codifying intellectual property to reduce risk within the organization from key people. And then, finally, the governance structure is an important piece of overhead discipline. And I'd say the governance structure becomes more important later down the line. As you're growing, having that in place and making sure that the governance is covering lots of different elements of a business to manage risk effectively and maintain performance.
So I want to get to that, and you've highlighted that in part of the four stages framework. But before we kick off and conclude in the balance of the analysis here, give us this sort of hit over the head idea of the common mistake that you see a lot of times with consulting firms as it pertains to operations.
Yeah, it's the common mistake that we see frequently from businesses that come to us and say, hey, you know what? I've grown my business and we've hit a brick wall. We're struggling to grow further past $10 million in revenue, $50 million in revenue, a certain threshold. And even if they are getting past that threshold, it's not occurring at profit margins that are in line with high performance consulting firms that we're reviewing. It's this view of saying, you know what, we're going to focus in on delivering services, growing, and we'll worry about our operations later down the line. We don't want to worry about it at the founder-led or team-based stage. That ultimately results in those inefficiencies being embedded for many firms. And what we find frequently is, we're working with businesses that are, they've actually scaled up to a certain level. Let's say it's $10, $15 million in revenue or above, but they have embedded inefficiencies within their organization, and that growth is not occurring with profitability. So it's not a value creation machine. So what we recommend as part of that is embed efficiencies early on, focus in on operations, back office to develop a value creation machine as you grow your firm.
And you've put some practical, tactical roadmap elements for each of these stages that we'll go through quickly. So in that founder-led, Tom and Ramon, give us maybe just some snippets of working capital management, cost monitoring, why this is important and how you would implement that at this stage.
Yeah, founder-led stage early on, we advise, hone in particularly on key risks around working capital. So, keep a buffer for working capital to weather downturns, enforce your payment terms, keep tight receivables policies. Project governance is all about ensuring consistent outcomes. And then, cost monitoring, very important at the early stages for both financial management and cash flow management. So I'd say put that in position early on so that when you build team members at the next stage, they can rely on that back office discipline.
And in stage two, there's some good ideas, and we see this with many of our clients, kind of bringing in the potentially fractional help, but bringing in folks who really drive the structure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in this, again, in the AI world that we're in now, there's a lot of options for fractional CFO and COOs that are AI enabled. So we're seeing a lot of firms that are earlier in their growth journey look towards fractional and AI enabled offerings to support them. What we do recommend is that as businesses grow, having a CFO or COO or an individual that has a combined role, important for and allowing the leadership team to focus in on growth and delivery, and also reducing key person risk. And that's important from an M&A perspective when firms look at the business and see it's not just relying on the founders.
And Tom, this goes back to your comment around kind of that client concentration.
Yeah.
In the process,
Yeah.
that idea of key person risk.
Yeah, there's two factors there. One is the concentration around clients. If 70% of your business is coming from a few key clients, you're potentially having problems. The flip side of that, and I mentioned before, is when you also take on the management role. We have instances where 4 founders will kind of split up the duties of running the firm, so to speak, because they think it's more efficient. Ultimately, it bogs down the business and stymies it. And this was a $10 million firm, and it just couldn't get past that next hurdle because they refused to relinquish that control. So,
in our last two, this is the governance, and Ramon, you touched on this early, kind of establishing that good governance tempo. But what does that mean for a firm as they grow?
Yeah, well, I think it has 2 real impacts. One, from an organic growth perspective, it can create a competitive edge, and secondly, from an M&A perspective, it can be attractive to potential buyers and investors. So important from really both dimensions. And at this stage of growth, M&A investment options start to open up. Right, you'll get typically at this stage, if you're performing well, lots of knocks on the door from potential investors and potential strategic acquirers. So when we think about good governance structures, we typically see it as including different elements, financial margin discipline that we've talked about before. Risk and compliance becomes very important. You need to be reviewing that on a regular basis. Service portfolio oversight, and a cadence really around investor and buyer or seller readiness, right? If you're considering M&A as an option. We often find that buyers and investors that see good governance controls within a professional services firm at this stage will see it as a signal of resilience, signal that the business can be scaled effectively, and that ultimately results in better valuations and more buyer interest.
So we'll close kind of with the last stage, and then we'd love to have some questions for Tom and Ramon from our participants today. But that enterprise stage, and Tom, you study the market makers, and Kennedy gives out a lot of research on what's changing in the market. But this is for that firm that's kind of arrived. And Ramon, you talk about exits and messiness and maybe eroding confidence because firms can't get their hands on the real data they can trust. But this seems to be the one that could really drive it home. And how do you see firms at this stage really separate themselves?
Yeah, I'd say in this era that we're in currently, data discipline is critical. What we find is that quality structured data makes a difference from what you're getting from your AI tools. And ultimately, if you're delivering unstructured, poor quality data to your tools, you're not going to be generating the insights that are going to be enabling tracking financial and business performance effectively, enabling better strategic outcomes and decision making, and also spotting risk within your organization. So we really do recommend data discipline being critical. That also has an M&A perspective as well, which again at this stage is important for many firms that we speak with. Buyers, investors will want businesses that have structured data within their organization, and they're utilizing that to make better decisions. Also, when you're reviewing a firm from an M&A perspective, having structured data makes due diligence a lot more quicker and efficient, right? And we see a lot of deals fall through because the data is a complete mess. It's all over the place. It slows down deals, it creates more uncertainty amongst buyers, and it can result in failed investment and M&A processes.
This has been great. And Tom, we've got a question from the audience as we wrap up our last 4 minutes that I think I'm going to throw over to you, and encourage anyone to certainly to chime in with questions. But the question is, we've talked about revenue targets when scaling in these 4 steps, really leading from sort of boutique to enterprise. Is there a typical time frame associated with moving up the rungs in those revenue targets that you see that's repeatable and successful firms being able to achieve?
There typically is, and it goes with kind of the founder motivation. Firms that just kind of are content doing what they do, the time frame is infinite. They just kind of trundle along and do what they do. A lot of firms think about it in 2 to 4 year increments, like where we want to be. And then ultimately it leads to that point Ramon's been making about valuation, like what's the value of the firm, so that you have options at some point. So to get past the founder, stage 1 is usually a 2 to 3 year process. By year 5, you should be between stage 2 and 3. And then the decision is to reach that, what we would call enterprise level, where you kind of get into the rarefied air. Typically, if you do that within 8 years or sooner, then you've done a good job. You kind of followed the guide. You have the discipline, and you've addressed a lot of those initial infrastructure pieces. But Ramon will tell you that there is no perfect time, but the sooner you do this, the better off you are to field those calls and to kind of have value for the firm. Ramon, you might have a thought there.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think, it depends on the mindset of the founders up front, right? That's a big element of it. And I'd also say a supercharging factor for many firms is receiving investment up front. So we see, some businesses that within 5 years, they've got to the enterprise stage. Typically, though, they've got investor backing and substantial investor backing and an aggressive plan for growth. So those 2 elements coming together can mean a very much a fast track of that growth journey.
Well, guys, this has been great. Appreciate the insight as always. And for those who participated, Tom and Ramon have been frequent podcast guests and power hours at both Kantata, and then co-published some research with us. You can find all their research at kennedyintel.com, but the practical insights from your analyses and studying actual firms, many of whom are clients and potentially prospects of ours, potentially partners with Kantata, has been really invaluable. And I appreciate the insights today.
Thanks, Brent. Same here.
I can't hear you over the music.